some of these questions to KV Subramanian, who was also economic advisor to the Prime Minister when he was in India before last year, December of 2022. Now, thank you, sir, for speaking to us. Now, the imputation from certain quarters that India got very lucky, and they say there are two basic reasons. More than expected global growth, and therefore we've not had the headwinds that were thought to be buffeting us. And secondly, the Modi government pumped in money into infra, etc., etc. How do you respond to this?
Rahul, let's look at the numbers. If we look at the growth rate last year, it was 7.2%. And my expectation is that when the final numbers come, final revised numbers, it'll be closer to 7.5%.
Okay.
The first quarter number was 7.8%. It is true that the second quarter in the United States has delivered, unexpected high growth, but that was not the case, with the last year or even the first quarter. So to attribute the high growth that India has been having now for almost 1.5 years, in fact, ever since the COVID pandemic, to luck is, in my opinion, not correct. It doesn't stand scrutiny when the numbers are looked at carefully. When it comes to, the infrastructure spending, I think that is something that is an aspect of policy. India was the only country among all the, large economies to identify very clearly and very early around March, April 2020 that COVID is going to be a big supply side shock. It is because of the recognition of that, that aspect of the crisis that India implemented significant infrastructure spending. The infrastructure spending that is happening, that is delivering, growth and is, likely to is already bringing in private investment. That is not luck. That is actually policy. So whether you look at, in a rigorous manner, growth numbers, not in a selective way, but, in a comprehensive way, and if you attribute the fact that infrastructure spending is a policy matter, well, I think some of these regular acknowledgements do not stand scrutiny.
Well, you're talking about data, so let me throw some data at you that has been fired by the Congress party, and they say that, look, the tax to GDP ratio, just have a look at that. And that tells you how we are growing or whether we are growing, etc., etc. And they've said it has remained steady since the UPA era between 16 to 17%. Yes, there have been a few ups and downs, but basically between 14.5% to about 16, 17%, and this is where it is today. So what is this whole big talk about data?
So I don't know whether you checked, I had put a tweet explaining that this was again another instance of very selective sampling of data. If you would recall in that piece, Rahul, I had shown, number one, the actual rupee numbers in tax collections. Second, I showed the actual tax to GDP ratio, then the direct tax to GDP and the indirect tax to GDP, so that we get a comprehensive picture rather than looking at it in a selective manner. That's the first thing. So if you look at just the rupee numbers itself, and the charts that I had included in that piece showed very clearly that there was a break in the trend compared to the decline that had come in around 2014-15, which itself was because of the mismanagement of the economy. And I explained in this tweet as well that the policy paralysis together with the crony lending and the paralysis in the economy, which reflected in India being part of the Fragile Five, all that got reflected in the direct tax collections. So if you see that, if that trend had continued, if nothing had been done on policy, we would have actually been seeing further declines in tax to GDP ratios, both direct and indirect tax ratios. In contrast, we've actually had an inversion, and that is the key point. So if you once again look at the data comprehensively, which many, oftentimes do not, I think it is absolutely clear that the policy implementation has been really important in changing the tax scenario.
I think you're referring to Praveen Chakravarti of the Congress. Praveen Chakravarti, of course, is the head of the Professional Congress, and he has put out numbers also Mr. Subramanian, he's also put out numbers. Now, what are we to do with those numbers? Should we disregard those numbers?
Yes, but I think as I was explaining earlier, Rahul, that the selective quoting of numbers was using just the the tax GDP numbers. And as I mentioned, it's very important that there was a declining trend, and that declining trend was not accidental. It was because of the way the economy was doing. And I think oftentimes those who don't think carefully do not take into account the what-if scenario. If nothing had been done, that trend that had been prevailing for almost 5 years would have continued. So the actual impact of policy is, what is the factual versus the counterfactual, the what-if scenario, and that clearly shows that there's been a significant improvement. As regards the indirect taxes and direct taxes, there are 2 points I want to make. First, India actually reduced its corporate tax rate in 2019, just before the COVID, and yet the direct tax to GDP ratio has increased, which is actually illustration of one of the key principles in taxation, which is the Laffer curve. That when you reduce tax rates, actually compliance improves, and that has brought the direct tax to GDP ratio back to its level. As for the indirect taxes, I think the implementation of GST has been a very important, move, which has reduced a lot of the inefficiencies in the system and has enhanced compliance. And that is why, the change in the indirect taxes, it is not because there is any regressiveness in the tax system, but better compliance. And I remember having been in government, there was an implementation of artificial intelligence, machine learning, etc., to ensure that compliance improves significantly in GST, and that is what has actually brought about the change. So overall, I have absolutely no hesitation in saying, when one looks at comprehensively and without jaundiced eyes, I think taxation policy is what has delivered this very good performance on tax, on the tax front.
There are statistics, and there are damn lies and statistics. So I'll for the moment defer to your statistics. But Raghuram Rajan, the former RBI chief, he's come out and said that India's current, and let me just quote him exactly, India's current pace of growth says, Rajan, will not allow it to march into Amrit Kal by even 2047. In fact, India, he says, will remain a middle income economy. How do you respond to this?
So I'm glad you asked this question, Rahul, because I'm in the process of writing a book, India at 100, India at the rate sign 100, where I will be, examining these aspects. There, I've actually done the projections. It's getting written up for the likely level of growth that India is, will experience in the next 25 years, and it actually is likely to be Amrit Kal. If you just look at build up bottoms up the model by looking at investment rates, looking at productivity, what is the rate that India is likely to have? It's likely to be 7% plus. And 7% plus for a population of 140 million is enormous. And if things go well, with a little bit of luck on our side, we could be very well be the second largest economy, or maybe even the largest economy in dollar terms by 2047. And that is what I'm working on.
Well, let's just hope that that scenario does in fact manifest itself. That would be glorious. But obviously, viewers, as we know, there are many curveballs that come our way. But let me ask you, because Mr. Rajan has also said that instead of focus on moving up service value chain rather than manufacturing to propel India, focus on that, moving up the services value chain rather than manufacturing. Now, if one were to accept this logic, then doesn't that go against the entire thrust on Make in India, manufacturing sector?
So, and this I've said this multiple times, Rahul, before. when you look at the the demography, India has a very young population, and there are a lot of youth that are actually coming into the workforce. We need to provide them high quality jobs. When I was the chief economic advisor, on one occasion I actually did mention, saying if somebody woke me up at 3 o'clock in the night and said, what is it that keeps you awake? What is it that you would really recommend? The three priorities, I would say jobs, jobs, and jobs. And I think, it is really important to acknowledge that the manufacturing sector growth is really critical for creating good jobs in the economy. When I look at, when I used to be at the Indian School of Business, some of the young, boys who would come to actually do housekeeping work, I would think about, these folks could actually go and work in a factory, have permanent income, not have the uncertainty. And that is why, and if you go back to Milton Friedman, one of the doyens of University of Chicago, his permanent income hypothesis, he also says that when expected permanent income changes, consumption changes. So even from a macroeconomic perspective of increasing demand, jobs for the burgeoning youth is extremely critical, and manufacturing is important.
Okay, the one thing we hear, since you're talking about jobs, the one thing we constantly hear is that fine, jobs might be being created, there's a whole gig economy, but the quality is lacking. The quality of jobs is lacking. People are not doing jobs that they're qualified to do. They're basically overqualified for a large number of jobs. How do you respond to that narrative?
This is again an aspect where I've written extensively on, Rahul. A recent piece on in the Times of India where I looked at this in the employment numbers. If you look at the salaried, or those that have a permanent job, look at the proportion or increase in that, and actual numbers as well. There's been significant increase, not just post-COVID, but even before COVID. So I think if you look at the numbers carefully, again, I will repeat, not with a jaundiced eye, then even quality of jobs has improved significantly. Focus on the correct numbers. And let me add that, oftentimes those with jaundiced eyes want to go and look at the unreliable, noisy CMI data because it fits their narrative. But the PLFS data is the one that actually has a robust survey methodology. And, when you look at that data, both quantity and quality of employment has significantly increased. So I'm, of the view that even when CMI gives good news on employment, we should not be looking at because it is completely unreliable data.
Well, KV Subramanian, thank you for speaking to us. And the reason why one is going along with you is because, of course, you have a reputation to defend your inner professional environment. So one would expect you to be speaking the absolute truth and not through, as you have said, a jaundiced lens. I leave it at that. Viewers, you can judge the responses for yourself. Have a Merry Christmas.